joined right now by Michael Zazzio. Michael, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing very fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to see you. You're in Sweden, isn't that right?
Oh, yeah, that's correct.
And you and I met through Ole Damegard. You've previously appeared on Light on Conspiracies with Ole Damegard. People can see that on Patreon and Subscribestar. Give the viewers just a little bit of background on yourself for people who perhaps haven't seen you before.
Well, I'm a registered nurse. I'm a private clinician and a researcher in audiology and equilibriometric, which is balance disorders. And I also do some research in infectious medicine. Right.
You've helped a lot of people with hearing issues, and you spoke with us about some of the great success you've had and some of the unconventional treatment for cochlea and things like that within the ear. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Great.
And I do treat mainly tinnitus problems, tinnitus problems, and hyperacusis problems, disorders, but also some age-related hearing damage and hearing loss and sudden deafness and the Meniere disease.
Right.
Plus some.
Yeah, very interesting. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to cut you off there, but this is hearing issues that affect a lot of people. You're going to be speaking with us today, of course, about something that a lot of people are very concerned about. It's been all over the mainstream news. I'm talking about this coronavirus we've been hearing so much about. What is it that you feel we haven't been told about the coronavirus?
Well, the media. First, maybe I should tell the listeners about my organizational efforts. I am a member of the Swedish National Health Federation organization, which is tied to the American one. I think you got a link to the American homepage. The thing is that I've been working in infectious medicine, and I have also been studying for many, many years, more than a decade, the New World Order and the organizations that are trying to run the world and create a one world government. But I'm also very interested in and digging deep into climate change problems. I've been studying astronomy and geology as well as medicine. And I have also been digging deep into the financial point of view regarding those things, and of course the medical way to try to govern people, nations, areas, and the whole globe.
Right.
When this came out, I instantly started to put up some hypotheses, a number of them. And what you do when you work with the scientific method is that you put up a hypothesis, and then you try to verify what you have as an aim. The aim is to verify it scientifically, and what you do is that you try to find it through information, through evidence that are presented. And there are certainly several evidences here that are pointing in a direction that this could be planted. I'm not saying it is, but that's one of the hypotheses that I'm working from.
Right. We've got a question coming from Tom Spann, who, if memory serves, was I believe, a corpsman in Vietnam. He's got some medical background, and he's asking if you can define the phases of a pandemic. This virus has apparently crossed 3 species, so it's approaching phase 4. What can you say about that?
Well, I'm not certain about the definitions of this of the different levels, but a pandemic is. There are some. The United Nations has one way of specifying it, and there are other ways. The same is valid for an epidemic. If we start with an epidemic, it is actually so that an epidemic is when something is being spread or is apparent in a large number of patients. It must not be an infection. It must not be a bacteria. It must not be a virus. It could also be a toxin, actually. So even a pandemic could be described and specified from this point of view. It could be a toxic substance which is sold and distributed from, for example, from China, which occurred a couple of years ago, I think 10 years ago. There was a toxin, a toxic substance, which was should have been a plant sold and harvested in China and sold all over the world. And it had benefits when it came to losing weight, to get slender, more slender than some people are. But it was there was another plant which was called the same thing. And they took that plant instead and made this remedy out of it and sold it and distributed it all over the world. And it was sold in China and caused a lot of kidney failure, and also in Belgium. And that was called an epidemic. So it must not be referring to a virus, a viral infection or a bacterial one. It could be anything, which is not very well for your body.
Right. Well, that feeds somewhat into my next question. Sam Rick is asking, isn't this the same as SARS from a few years ago? And frankly, my question is...
Yeah, it's actually 17.
Yeah, it seems like we're hearing about all these different pandemics or potential pandemics all the time, whether it's bird flu or swine flu or rush out to CVS and get your flu shot. I mean, is this fear-mongering? I mean, there's billions of people in China. How many have been affected by this coronavirus?
Well, first of all, to answer the first question, fear-mongering, yes. There are some things that is really defining fear-mongering, and it's used mainly by the vaccination industry, of course, because they want to sell their vaccines. And when it comes to this viral infection, this kind of virus, which is called the coronavirus, it doesn't look like a corona. It looks like one of those massage balls that in plastic that you use when you roll over it and you put it under your back or something like that.
Massage ball virus doesn't roll off the tongue, however, so I don't think
it doesn't.
It
doesn't scare people. That's correct. So you have to find out some kind of word which is making it a little more, intimidating, I would call it. But the vaccine industry is interested in this, that it will cause, make people going gonzo, of course. The interesting thing here is that 2 months ago, approximately, there was actually the FDA in the United States of America had an application about this vaccine against coronavirus. And it has been confirmed that it could be used, and it's part of the medical system now. So there is a vaccine, and very well, this is very well timed. The virus infection is spreading in China. And I don't know if this is planted or not, but there are some things which is pointing out that it could very well be.
Right. We've heard a lot of... Yeah, we will, of course. We've heard a lot of information about bioweapons labs. There was some story about a Canadian lab that was developing this that expelled some Chinese scientists who went to Wuhan, the first city where this broke out, and where, the first story that I saw said that 33 million people were under quarantine. And, right away, when I see that in the mainstream news, I don't think that is numerology. I think that the number 33 is used as a steganographic messaging marker to send out a message to people who are in the know that this is a fake story, potentially. So what can we say about the planting of this, or what's the real danger for our viewers who are in Scandinavia or Europe or North America?
Well, in Scandinavia, we have one case in Finland. It was a Chinese tourist coming to the northern parts of Finland, and she is treated in a hospital, in an infectious clinic and in a sealed clinic. And there's also been some 15 people who's been in contact with this woman, and those are under observation, which means that they are also in a clinic. And they are also isolated in maybe not the strongest level of isolation, but isolated in a way. In America, there are some cases, I don't remember if it was 5 or so, and, well, it's not scary, this. I mean, if you have the regular flus that are annually sweeping around the world, those really kill a lot of people. This could kill a lot of people if it's getting spread. And what is interesting here is that it has been spread. There's about 105 or so cases all over the world, apart from China. And those 105 cases includes Hong Kong. But if you watch China, it's being told that we have at least 7,600 people infected in mostly in the Hubei area, which is in the center of the eastern part of China. But it's been spread all over all regions in China. There's no unaffected region. And the authorities have sealed off some 55 million people in the Wuhan and the neighboring town areas. So it's really affecting China. This could affect it in many ways. Other parts has not been sealed off. And the thing is that they have more than 10 cases in Beijing, which is interesting.
And do we have any statistics? Sorry, Michael. Any statistics on how many people die of other sicknesses in China per day? I mean, it seems like a small number, even if we're talking about 1,000 people.
Yeah, it is a small number. In the Hubei area, where those 55 million people live, the part which is sealed off, there are some 1,800 people dying every day from regular diseases, age-related death, and so on. I mean, the way people die. So those cases, a little more than now, I think 100 people who have died, is nothing compared to that.
Right.
But there is a potential risk. And we'll get into that later on.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, what I'm most interested in is the mainstream news reaction. I mean, we've heard that Apple is closing its stores because of coronavirus worries. And this starts to play into what some people have suspected is that there's a real economic aspect to this. And is there any involvement by perhaps organizations that may have an interest in putting pressure on China's economy? Donald Trump, of course, has recently signed a trade deal with China. And there's a lot of pressure on Apple. We've even heard William Barr in a press conference just a couple of weeks ago about this Saudi Arabian airman who shot up the U.S. Naval Air Base in Pensacola, Florida. William Barr gave a press conference where he seemed much more focused on putting pressure on Apple to eliminate encryption from the iPhone so the FBI could more easily penetrate and gain information about U.S. citizens and people around the world, seemed less concerned about prosecuting the Saudi Arabians. So Donald Trump, in response to that, said that the United States has made a lot of concessions for Apple with regard to trade. Here we see Apple stores in China closing. To what extent is this a deep state operation, Michael?
That's exactly one of my hypotheses. If it is a deep state, organized, undercover work, if so, they are actually succeeding. And that could explain a lot which is going on now. A deep state could, of course, buy people executing such things as spreading virus in China, etc. A deep state could be interested in eradicating the possibilities for China to compete with the United States economy. Because if China falls, all other economies will get stronger because there's a financial balance in this. And we have an approaching, the everything bubble, which we're in right now, is popping. It's an ongoing event. It's going very slowly. The Federal Reserve is printing a lot of money. We are in a QE4 now, which has been a lot of people who have been in the financial business have been warning about this QE4. It's not called QE4, but it is one. And they're printing almost $1 trillion a year, which is almost the same amount of money, which is what the United States does pay for everything they do, apart from the taxes that, again, the United States is bankrupt, and the deep state knows this. And if the United States is bankrupt and the dollar is going to fall, then what's going to happen? The people in the deep state, they have a lot of money. Yeah. They're part of they're part of the plutocracy, which the United States has become, and many other parts of the world as well. The European Union, which Sweden is a membership nation of, is a real problem. We see that freedom of expression is being limited more and more. We see that a lot of things occur, that there's a larger tax confiscation. We're putting taxes on everything. Donald Trump's doing the right thing when he's trying to prevent the American people from not getting enough energy, because energy is the foundation of prosperity. Mm-hmm. And a country such as Sweden is now raising taxes on petrol, is going to raise taxes on things that are connected to oil production, etc. And this is not very well. This is not beneficial for the prosperity of a country.
Mm-hmm. I just returned from Norway. State, yeah. Sorry to interrupt you there, but I just returned from Norway, where I learned that despite the discovery of oil in Norway in the 1960s, which has taken them from a very economically depressed economy to one of the wealthiest nations in the world. They've got the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, and per capita, they're one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Despite that fact, the popular opinion about the environment and climate change is creating a debate in Norway where they actually may move away from the oil and gas industry and totally remove themselves from that.
Which is crazy. Electricity produced by wind turbines is forbidden to own privately in Norway. They have crazy laws regarding energy production. And moving away from oil, moving away from burning coal is stupid today, as when we burn it today, the smoke, well, there's almost no smoke. There's carbon dioxide and there's water. It's not polluting anymore as it did during the 60s and 70s.
Interesting.
Today, it's very, very, very clean.
Wow. You know, you're talking about the economic effects of the coronavirus. I don't know if people are familiar with Patrick Bet-David. He's got a great YouTube channel called Valuetainment, and he's just published today an interview with Rich Dad, Poor Dad author Robert Kiyosaki, who's predicting a global depression. Do you think this coronavirus outbreak plays any role in that, and what are the implications?
Well, it's not only Robert, it's also Peter Schiff, Mike Maloney, and several other people who are very deep into the financial problems of the global problems, and also the problems of the United States of America regarding the financial situation. I agree with those people. We're not only heading for a recession, we're heading for a depression, and it's going to be even worse than the 1929 depression. There was another recession before that in 1921, which was almost as difficult as the Great Depression. And there was another one a little later. Those were severe. I think that what is coming now is going to be even worse. And the deep state knows about this. The deep state individuals, those who are part of this organization, they are part of the plutocracy. They have a lot of money. They don't want to lose everything they own just because the dollar is going to go down, and the euro, and the Japanese yen, and the British pound. This is severe, and they are doing what they can. So if they make 1 or 2 or 3 large countries in the world fall, they will gain on it.
So it seems like we're seeing a lot of different examples, Michael, around the world, whereas, perhaps in the 1960s, if the United States wanted to exert influence over Vietnam, there was a straight bombing war over there. We would just kill them. Now we've got all these other theaters, basically. We've got psychological warfare being waged against civilian populations around the world. Ole has done numerous shows on Light on Conspiracies where he's spoken about the psychological warfare against the people of Sweden. He's really spoken about Sweden as a crucible for a lot of this. And we've spoken to Biljana Martinovsky and you and to others who have told us about the extreme censorship that's going on in social media. Biljana's been detained by the police. They've forcibly taken DNA samples from her. We've spoken to other people about psychological warfare being waged through social media. I think a lot of people are aware that there's been an effort afoot to deplatform Crowdsource the Truth, and I hope that people will join us on Subscribestar and Patreon to help counteract that effort. But to what extent is this, I know you're speculating, but this is yet another theater of warfare, isn't it? If there can be biological warfare coupled with psychological warfare, maybe this is something that came out of a laboratory and people get sick. There was a video going around social media yesterday of a guy on a subway train throwing up blood. People were speculating this was visual effects. What can you say about any of these things?
Well, it's possible because this virus affects the lungs primarily. And if you get an infection in the lungs and it's a severe virus, when you get a virus, some of those viruses that you get, we would get one every week during our whole lifetime. We're constantly infected by viruses. Some bring along symptoms, some don't. But those are that's about how regular it is, once a week, approximately. So you're never healthy.
Right.
We can tolerate those.
But your immune system is fighting these viruses, right?
Of course. But, when your nose is getting a little rinsing and all that, then you're probably affected by a virus. Bacteria, they do not cause that kind of symptoms. They cause other symptoms. But now, what was your question again?
Well, I'm just curious.
I slipped away there.
Yeah, I think people want to know if this is a planned outbreak that perhaps is, it just feels like we're being bombarded with information about this that's intended to make people scared. And then when I hear 3 days into it that they've got a vaccine and there's patents for coronavirus and there's a lab in Canada that Chinese scientists were, it just all seems too coincidental.
Well, it could be a coincidence, but the chances, what are the chances of that? I hardly think so. But I have to correct you. I do not speculate. I have hypotheses, and then I try to verify those hypotheses, whether they are true or not. If they're falsifying, the hypothesis is incorrect. This is the scientific method. It should be used everywhere. When it comes to Sweden, because you spoke about it, and when it comes to Sweden, Sweden has, in many ways, throughout history during the past decades, it's been a test country. You test things in Sweden. If it works there, you go on testing it in another country, and you test it on people that do not oppose to what is tested. Mm-hmm. You test it on people who are timid to begin with, then you test it on other populations, and finally you test it on laughing people. Because laughing people, they will riot if they're not getting along with what's going on. You can see that because in France it's going on for the 64th week now, the demonstrations, the rallies in the streets.
Yellow vests.
And yes.
And to be clear, you're not...
there is...
Sorry, Michael. To be clear, you're not making some sort of racist, prejudice type of statement. You're referring to perhaps psychological surveys that have determined if you were to do something to the population in Chile or Brazil, there is generally a different reaction than what's happening in Sweden. culturally speaking.
Yeah, you can see the rallies in Chile, which is actually towards the is a reaction towards the government and the president. Things like that does not occur in Sweden. Mm-hmm. That's the reason why things are tested here.
Right.
It's a 10 million population.
Right, we've heard this.
It's a 10 million people population, and it's easier to test it on a larger population than on, for instance, a country such as Liechtenstein, or it's a little too small for that. It has to be a certain amount of people.
Yeah. So it causes me to wonder to what extent, large-scale psychological studies perhaps have been done to determine which countries they should do these types of things in. And I mean, I've been to Sweden, of course, as one person. It's difficult for me to make an evaluation of the whole country, but I've heard now from several Swedish people, including Ole and yourself, that in general, Swedish people tend to be passive and they're more focused on, avoiding conflict than necessarily standing up to authority. Whereas, as you said, we're seeing it play out that police in Santiago are firing tear gas and water cannons at protesters, and it's just not stopping them. These types of protests just don't occur in Sweden.
No, they don't. Not in Sweden. And what is interesting when it comes to Sweden, during the past year, we had more than 200 bombings.
Right.
In different cities, towns. That's a large problem. 200 bombings on a population of 10 million. In the rest of the Nordic countries, in Finland, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, there was one. There was only one bomb going off in those countries, and we had 200 in Sweden. I don't think, because those countries have a lot of immigrants as well, and immigrants are being blamed for the bombs in Sweden. I don't think so. I think this is an inside job to scare up the people.
Yes, and Ole concurs with you. He said exactly that. Ole's pointed out how, just like I point to the number 33 as a steganographic marker, Ole has pointed out that almost always when we're hearing these types of stories, there's a couple of visual cues that are used in the reporting. Abandoned bicycles, abandoned backpacks, and shoes being three of the items that Ole has referenced as almost always being present in these photographs, where they don't necessarily, they're not alleging that the bomb was in this backpack, and obviously the backpack is still there intact while the bomb squad is on site. But Ole mentioned that Sweden has created some new bomb task force, which he suspects of being responsible for the bombs.
Could be, but could also be, for instance, a NATO organization or so, a military organization, paramilitary or whatever, coming to Sweden doing this undercover. So this is a possibility, and it's a hypothesis which has to be explored. When you look back on China in this case, we know what China had, what kind of dictatorship China is. It's definitely not a democracy.
Right.
Even though there's an ongoing democratical, motion in the country, slowly, just as in many other countries, neighboring countries such as Vietnam. But the Hubei area, there are 55 million people actually that are sealed off from the rest of the country here. So it's not 33, but why do someone use the 33 number? I'm a little thinking about the 2nd of February, 2020-0202. What's going to go off then?
Right.
We know that those people are interested in numerology and balance in numerology, and that's really a balanced date when it comes to that. This viral infection, which is occurring, what is interesting here is as well that you have, for instance, from yesterday to today, we had an increase of deaths and the number of cases, which raised by 30%. Just from one day to the other. Actually, the numbers from the day before was an increase by 140%, when it comes to those affected, those infected. So this is interesting, but it's a severe increase in number of infected people. And I think that this could actually be an exponential outbreak. And in that case, it's going to be pretty awkward.
Well, what do you mean?
And scary. I mean, if the outbreak is exponential and you don't have a multiplicator that you say from one day to the other, it's 1.3 times more infected people than the day before. Maybe it's going to be doubled, and the next day tripled, and the next day quadrupled. That's exponential. It's going to increase. Maybe it's 2 times 2, 3 times 3, 4 times 4 the next day. So the increase could be tremendous. And the time from when you're exposed to the virus until you have symptoms could be is within the span from 8 to 14 days. That's the incubation time. There's a lot of people that has not been diagnosed who are constantly walking around spreading this virus. And it seems like it's even more infectious than the measles virus, which is extremely infectious. But the measles is definitely not a very scary disease.
Well, but see, that's a good example that you raised, because here in the United States, it wasn't that long ago that we heard people freaking out that there were measles cases at Disneyland or whatever. And that was another case where I just sort of thought, well, who cares? A couple people get measles. I mean, I seem to think you get that. And I mean, look, there's somebody who's going to die from, you cut your finger and get a blood infection. Is everybody going to freak out about that? I mean, the thing I think I'm trying to get at is this something that people really need to be worried about, or is this just another example of the mainstream media and large governments working together to freak everybody out and keep everybody in a constant state of panic?
Fear and panic. Well, I don't think that the media always reflects over what they're doing, but there's no reason to be scared. There's no reason to freak out.
Right.
It will be if things turn out in other places, in other parts of the world, as they have turned out in this, in China, and especially in this province, the Hubei area. But the thing is, when we watch what is occurring now, they have a coronavirus patent. It was patented year 2017, I guess. And a couple of years later, they have this outbreak. And 2 months before the outbreak, or almost when the outbreak started, they got a patent for a vaccine.
Right. That's what I mean. So it sounds very much like the business model of, the McAfee software company, where they're telling you about computer viruses and who would possibly benefit from that other than the people selling you the antivirus solution. And I mean,
and the stockholders, the shareholders.
Right. But it's that problem solution, problem reaction solution. So here we see a patent. This is a European patent for the coronavirus. And this thing was issued, what's the date of issue here?
Application date 2015. It was issued 2016. Yeah.
So, I mean, what are we looking at here, Michael? This just seems like they're making viruses and then releasing them.
Another thing which is a little scary is, why do we have laboratories working with the development of virus and bacteria such as, why do anthrax, you remember that?
Of course.
That was a situation where there was anthrax sent to politicians or whatever in letters. And that anthrax, which was actually a kind of anthrax germ which was developed in an American military lab.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've heard a lot about that from David Hawkins on his Discovery CSI program on Fridays on Patreon and Subscribestar, where he says that it was an aerosolized version of anthrax, inhalation anthrax, that was very, carefully manufactured through a high-tech process that allowed the anthrax virus to become airborne and become an inhalation form of anthrax. So, again, this just seems like biological warfare being waged against people. And when we see, look, the United States is such a influential country, and obviously what's going on here with the ongoing impeachment trial against President Donald Trump, in my view, is a deep state attempt to remove the rightfully elected president who perhaps is fighting against some of the agenda that these evil, entrenched bureaucrats want to execute. To what extent is a virus like this an offshoot of the attempts to remove President Donald Trump?
Well, it could be a parallel occurrence. The impeachment of Donald Trump is actually run by the Democrats, and recently the Democrats were, there was somebody revealed that the Democrats had planned to kill off a lot of people in the United States. This reached me a couple of weeks ago. So this is pretty interesting. I would want to go back to the vaccine industry because in the year 2017, there was an analysis made in Germany, and the analysis was made on 16 vaccines for infections. And all 16 of those contained aluminum, and in larger quantities than specified on the insert package. Mm-hmm. That's what the vaccine industry does. But not only that, they also tried it for uranium and found 15 vaccines out of the 16 contained uranium.
Wow.
Which is always
highly toxic.
Well, it's toxic and it radiates gamma radiation.
Wow.
So
see, this is interesting because, I just want to say, you've just said something that the skeptical among our viewers might be shocked by, which is a plan that Democrats would kill large numbers of Americans. Now, on its face, this sounds quite maybe hard for people to...
Yeah, those 16 vaccines also contain too much mercury,
right?
Which is also toxic. Both mercury and aluminum in the blood system or in the biological system is hardly wanted.
Right. But that statement about Democrats wanting to kill people, it may be shocking for some people to hear, but I want to take people back to the Weather Underground, another topic that David Hawkins speaks about all the time. And we've got Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers pictured here. They openly said, before it was called the Weather Underground, their organization was called Students for a Democratic Society. So this was a socialist organization, and we hear nothing but talk of socialism among American Democrats right now. When I visited Sweden in 2018 with Ole Damegard, many Swedes told me that democratic socialism had destroyed the country of Sweden. And socialism, communism, a lot of people are saying that some of these societies are placated by socialism. Here we see the Democrats in the United States trying to suppress capitalism in the United States, wanting to open the borders, wanting to basically, tax billionaires out the wazoo. So I just want people to understand that you're not throwing out wild comments. It's also important to remember that Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers are very closely associated with Barack Obama. And I don't know if you've heard about this, but the new DA in San Francisco was actually raised by Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers. So we've now got a San Francisco district attorney who is basically a child of the Weather Underground.
Yeah, and Obama was more or less raised by Brzezinski.
It's interesting. I didn't know that.
More or less. Yeah. Well, yeah, sure. Everything's inherited. Most things are, and in a plutocracy, the rich guys make their children go into politics, make their children go into the companies, make the children decide what they would decide if they would continue to live forever. but they don't. So they have to apply this on their children, and the children brings it on. It always works like that, more or less.
Right.
I don't want to get into politics, but if you compare fascism, Nazism, and communism, it's the same. There's no difference. I mean, communism is not based upon the company is ruling a country in the way as fascism does, but it works the same way. It oppresses the people the same way. And socialism, if you look at if it's communism or socialism, well, the difference may not be too large. If you look at, for instance, Cuba, which is called a socialist country, I mean, they killed off a lot of people when the revolution went on, and in the Soviet Union, they killed off, I don't know how many, but it seems like it's 150 million, 145 or 50, and it's the same amount, a little more, in China during that revolution. Which was called the Cultural Revolution. I mean, what kind of culture is it to kill people?
Right. Yeah, I guess that's socialist culture. It's interesting because, the other thing that we haven't quite touched on just yet is eugenics. And we've heard about how Planned Parenthood and some of these other things are started by people who, it's not widely known today, but are basically known eugenicists. And we've heard this said of Bill Gates, and he is teaming with Chinese billionaire Jack Ma, the guy who owns Alibaba, and Apple, to donate millions to fight the outbreak. What do we know about Bill Gates and his response or statements to this coronavirus?
Well, I know that Bill and Linda, through their foundation, or maybe privately, are indicted in India for killing a lot of people and damaging a lot of people's health through vaccines. And we know that on the Philippines, and let's see here, the Philippines, I think it was also in India, it was definitely in Latin America, I think it was even in Mexico. They found sterilization substances in the vaccines.
Yeah.
And I think John Holdren, who is this climate prophet, and he's never been right, I think he suggested that we should kill off people in Africa by putting toxins in their streams.
Wow. Yeah. I wonder how Africa felt about that.
Well, he suggested that in the United Nations.
Wow. That's shocking.
Yeah.
Who the hell, I mean...
That's shocking.
Yeah.
I think it was during the late 60s or early 70s.
Wow. So now we've got this thing, anytime something calls itself factcheck.org, I'm not sure what to think about that, but factcheck.org is telling us that new coronavirus wasn't predicted in a simulation. Seems like a lot of these simulations are created just to fool people. But and here again, we see Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others predicted up to 65 million deaths via coronavirus in a simulation 3 months ago. So Bill Gates obviously knew about coronavirus.
Yes, he did. But this is a pretty small number if you wanna deplete the population.
Well, 65 million.
Eradicate. Yeah, if you want to eradicate some 7 billion people on the earth, to maintain those 500 million that the Georgia Guidestones are telling us that we should live in harmony with nature. I mean,
sorry,
come on.
I've read this a little more carefully. So this article is saying that InfoWars has published a story saying that Bill and Melinda Gates predicted this 3 months ago. So the foundation funded a group that owns a virus patent. So that's interesting. I guess this is one of these websites that's designed to tell you that whatever Alex Jones is saying is not true. But it's certainly interesting, as you pointed out, that there's a patent on this thing. I mean, it's not like some new disease arrives, we don't know what it is, somebody figures it out, and then there you go. It seems very much, if it's got a patent, like a man-made thing.
Yeah. And the question is, as I said, why do we have labs bringing up those germs and those viruses? Why do we have that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Well, I don't know, Michael. I think it's got to be for exactly this type of reason. It seems like a great business to be in if everybody is afraid of getting sick. I mean, everywhere I go in New York City, I'm seeing signs imploring people to get the flu vaccine, which I
Don't.
never do. Yeah. But they're obviously
Don't.
making a ton of money from it. They see this is what's interesting in the United States, because a lot of people think that Obamacare is this gift from the government. You know, people want free health care and they feel like that's their God-given right. But why isn't free food a God-given right? Why isn't a free home a God-given right? It seems to me without those two things, your health is going to be in jeopardy a lot more quickly than if you don't have, you know, cancer surgery. Hopefully most people won't get cancer, but certainly that happens way later in life. You could be a little kid with no food and no house and you could die right away. But there's this argument about health care.
In a country, I mean, I'm also an editor of actually 2 magazines, and I have met so many children and parents of those children who died from vaccination, who got severe injuries, who developed autism, HDAD, etc. ADHD, sorry. And to me, and when I look at the research that is made afterwards, in long term, after the introduction of the vaccines on the market, the results differ very much from what was presented before those got accepted as medical substances on the market.
Yeah, I want to remind
the vaccine
people,
industry is profitable, very
Absolutely.
profitable.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I want to remind people to check out Del Bigtree's movie, Vaxxed. And we should also recall that one of the most prominent politicians in the United States today, the dishonest, unconstitutional dope, Adam Schiff, was personally responsible for having this movie removed from Amazon.com, of course owned by Jeff Bezos, who had that $600 million contract with the CIA. So it's a tightly knit group. I mean, you know, there's a really strong movement that wants to basically villainize anyone who questions the efficacy or the safety of a vaccine. They just want to label you as a crazy person right away. And I mean, look, I think that there is medical value to vaccinating people against dangerous and deadly diseases, but it's important that we know what's contained in these vaccines. As you said, uranium, mercury, these things are potentially extremely harmful. And when we hear about patents for diseases, that certainly wasn't the lead story in The Guardian, that a patented virus is causing an outbreak. They just want everybody to freak out and get the vaccine.
Yeah, and the latest research, which is also presented by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's working incessantly with these questions. He's really he's one of my heroes, and he has actually also presented that 43% of the cases that get the HPV vaccines, those kids get severe injuries and long-term effects. It's definitely not a vaccine that I can't recommend any vaccine today after what I've been working with during the past 5 years.
Wow. And have you seen this, Michael? I don't know what KHN is, but in this morning briefing, they say that the family of Robert Kennedy Jr. has publicly chastised him for disseminating dangerous, what they call dangerous misinformation about vaccinations. I think that's a very unfair characterization, but I mean,
again,
yes,
it is.
Yeah,
he's basing everything upon science. Everything he presents is based upon science.
And he's a credible guy. The way he presents the information is very powerful. And, you know, he did a presentation. It was interesting. When President Trump was first inaugurated, we had I think it was at the National Press Club, some meeting with Robert Kennedy Jr. and Robert De Niro, who famously has been, you know, I kind of don't like Robert De Niro any longer for this stance that he's taken against President Trump, despite the fact that Robert De Niro shares some of these Robert Kennedy Jr. opinions on vaccination, and that he was given a platform by the president. He's been just totally negative towards President Trump. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
No, it doesn't make any sense to me either. But I mean, he doesn't mix opinions about vaccines with politics, obviously. But what Robert De Niro has done when it comes to vaccination, I think, that makes him a little better character in that light.
Yeah, and you know, the other thing is, I don't know if you're aware that Robert De Niro, I'm looking up exactly what the credential is, but he's like an honorary member of the CIA or something like that. He was inducted into the Spy Museum Hall of Fame. I may be stating this inaccurately. We need to ask Kevin Shipp. We're going to have Kevin on next week on the intelligence assessment with Kevin Shipp, but he's spoken about Robert De Niro's relationship with the CIA. It's very troubling.
Well, I think it could also be dependent on the fact that Robert De Niro has been making a lot of characters in several films that are, I mean, in one way or the other, close to what the CIA is doing. So it may have to do with it. They have to have a facade as well. They have to present some famous face for what they're doing and connect it to that. I don't know, but...
Well, I mean, along those lines, we've recently explored that popular news presenter Sean Hannity has been seen frequently wearing a CIA pin on his jacket lapel right there. So, again, is Sean Hannity telling us the news that people want to hear, or is he telling us the news that the CIA wants people to hear? It's a big question.
Or maybe he's telling the story that I'm part of the system. You can't get me.
Right. Well, either way, it doesn't seem like he's really on the side of people who want honest news. But I do appreciate what you're sharing with us, Michael. And, you know, it's important that our viewers remember that I can't keep bringing them guests like you without viewer sponsorship. So I hope that people watching now will join us on subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I've got another great episode of Dr. Corsi's Prescription for America coming up later today. Michael, was there anything else you wanted to share with us before we wrap it up for this morning? How can people get in touch with you and learn more about your work?
Well, I'm not affiliated actually with anything presented in English because I work in Sweden, but I think that you should take a look at the National Health Federation in the United States of America and become a member of that organization to support freedom of health, which is important because nowadays, for example, in California, I mean, in many American states, there's a mandatory vaccination policy.
Yeah.
And for children, but in California, they've also there are some new laws that makes vaccination mandatory even for adults and seniors.
Wow. Yeah, it's very scary.
We're seeing those motions in other countries as well. And as I told you, in Germany, we had this analysis of the vaccines, 16 vaccines, and an analysis which would make the German politicians aware that this is a scary business. But what did they do? They decided that measles vaccines would be mandatory. And measles vaccines have been verified in an analysis to contain 560 cancer genes recently in Italy in a certified lab. And this is scary. And even in Italy, they have decided that there is mandatory vaccination for children. And if you don't do it, you'll pay a fine, and that fine is definitely large. In Germany, it's about, I think it was around $7,000 or so. In Italy, it's a little lower, but I mean, if you're a worker, if you're not earning too much and you live from paycheck to paycheck, as most people do or a lot of people do in America right now, in the United States, and as most Chinese families do right now in this area where they have sealed off countries, which will cause a lot of people tremendous difficulties, financially, tremendously difficult situations.
Sure. And well, listen, a fine is one thing. I'm not trying to minimize the value of a fine, but keep in mind that even if you are a person who could, say, opt to pay a $7 or $10 or even $100,000 fine to protect the health and safety of your child, some might opt to do that. I think the bigger thing is that that seems like a baby step towards a move where once you defy a mandatory vaccination law, what would stop the government from taking your child away from you? And, then no amount of money can stop that. We've learned from what Dr. Corsi experienced, and last night Mike Moore interviewed Joe Nacio, the former CEO of Quest, who was a billionaire when the deep state came after him, and all of his money didn't protect him from being thrown in prison and falsely accused. So this is a really troubling development in the United States, these mandatory vaccinations, because if you defy that and they send child protective services or whatever to separate you from your child, that becomes a very scary prospect.
And that also occurs in Sweden right now, and in Finland, and in Norway.
Wow. Very scary.
It's not mandatory, but if you don't vaccinate, they will take your children away from you.
That sounds mandatory to me. Michael, it's been a great
That's
conversation.
Fascism.
It's fascism. It's crazy
fascism.
Is what it is. Yep. I really appreciate
because
you joining us. Oh, sorry.
The government is supporting the vaccination industry
right.
financially by doing this.
Well, and in the United States, what we learned from the Vaxxed movie, from Del Bigtree's fantastic film, is that even if the government's not directly supporting it, you get people who are working at, in the United States example, the Center for Disease Control, who know that as soon as they leave that position, there's a multi-million-dollar job waiting for them in the pharmaceutical industry. So corruption can affect all of this in terms of the legislation and the approvals of biologicals or pharmaceuticals or whatever the case may be. So it's a troubling situation. We're going to stay in touch, Michael, and as more information develops, we'd love to have you back on the show. I know people love hearing from you, and I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Finally, regarding CDC, I can tell you that the CDC, the board members of the CDC are affiliated with, most of them are affiliated with the vaccination and medical industry.
Right. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And that's something for people to be very concerned about. But Michael, we'll speak with you soon. I want to thank everybody for watching and remind everybody to tune in later for Dr. Corsi's Prescription for America. Nothing to do with vaccines. He's giving us a prescription for how to solve the political ailments that we're facing. I want to thank my guest, Michael Zazzio. I want to thank everybody for watching. Have a great day.
Thanks.